Ladies and gentlemen, can you please put your hands together for Pascal Michael, who's going to give a talk on consciousness.
Hello, everyone. Okay, I just wanted to say, Dad, your talk was beautiful, especially the poem at the end. Really lovely, Dad. Diamond Geezer. Okay, so I've called my talk Consciousness Sans Consensus, because I thought it just rolled off the tongue so easily. So one of my utmost favorite quotes by American medical scientist Robert Lanza pretty much perfectly sets the stage for this. The big problem is that life contains consciousness, which is, to say the least, poorly understood. And consciousness isn't just a problem for us biologists, it's a problem for physics. And there's nothing in physics that can explain how groups of molecules in the brain create consciousness. So the beauty of a sunset, the taste of a delicious meal, and how we subjectively feel them, these are all mysteries to science. Science cannot explain how consciousness arrives from matter. Our understanding of this most basic phenomenon is virtually nil. Some scientists insist the theory of everything is just around the corner, any day now. And this is not going to happen, and for a reason. And that is because we have shunted a very critical component out of our view, and that is, of course, consciousness. And it's not just a small item. Indeed, it's nothing like anything else. It is awareness, it is perception, and in an utter mystery, we think it somehow just arises from goo. Now, I wish I could have written something like that myself, but that was all Robert Lanza. Very clever guy. So, what exactly is this goo? So, brain chemicals, or neurotransmitters, such as serotonin or dopamine or noradrenaline, which you may be familiar with, they're secreted from neuronal axons. They traverse the synaptic cleft, bind to receptors of the postsynaptic neuron, in turn activating channels through which charged atoms such as sodium or potassium or chlorine or chloride, or calcium, they flow into or out of the cell. If that neurotransmitter is excitatory in nature, this creates a more positively charged environment within the cell, where the neuronal membrane is known to become depolarized. If depolarized enough, an action potential will be generated. That is, the neuron fires, entailing the exponential flux of sodium ions across the length of a neuron, ultimately meaning the release of further neurotransmitters at its terminal. And then the cycle repeats and repeats. All this occurs on a scale of approximately 87 billion neurons in the human brain. And each of these neurons will have a range of 100 to up to 10,000 synaptic connections. And its firing will depend on the summation of every one of these inputs. In 1 cubed centimeter of human brain tissue, there are as many synapses as stars in the Milky Way. These are facts of brain. The brain must be responsible for consciousness, surely. This is a model convincing us throughout contemporary science, powerfully suggested by local damage to brain areas producing specific disturbances in conscious experience, by brain areas lighting up during conscious activities, in fMRI, for instance, by drugs affecting neuropharmacology and thus altering faculties of the mind, by new synaptic maps being formed in memory brain areas, such as the hippocampus due to learning, etc. This is the neurocentric paradigm of consciousness. All this said, as Eben Alexander, a Harvard neurosurgeon, eloquently points out, no neuroscientist on Earth can give the first sentence to explain a possible mechanism by which the physical brain creates consciousness. The interesting thing about Dr. Alexander is that he underwent a near-death experience. And the most profound near-death experience, or NDE, that I've read, and one of the most popularly discussed. The NDE as a lot of my family and friends will know about me, is a phenomenon that I am borderline obsessed with for simply how astonishing it is and game-changing it's likely to prove. Clinically dead individuals who, upon resuscitating, do not report mere nothingness or void, but conscious and, importantly, deeply profound experiences. So this has very serious implications for consciousness. Alexander's NDE was when in lethal coma due to bacterial meningitis, which racked his brain and shut down his neocortex, essentially the outermost rind of the human brain. And conveniently, a neurosurgeon, after recuperating, he racked his brain as to neurological explanations of his rich and vivid conscious experience, all of which he claims to systematically dismiss as insufficient. One of these hypotheses, however, is referred to as DMT dump, a speculated mediator of these mystical type experiences at the moment of death. DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is the most potent hallucinogen known to man, and neuropsychiatrist Rick Strassman believes it to be naturally synthesized within the human pineal gland. And the pineal gland's been very peculiarly associated with spirituality and mysticism for millennia. For instance, Descartes believed it to be the point of intersection between the brain and the soul. And, for instance, Angkor Wat, an immense Buddhist temple in Cambodia, comprises of majestic, giant, pine cone-like structures. DMT is very structurally similar to serotonin, and it acts on specific receptors, such as within the neocortex. So Dr. Alexander's reason to dismiss this theory is that given the profundity of his full audio-visual experience, yet the sheer lack of auditory and visual neocortex on which the DMT must have acted, he renders it simply an untenable hypothesis. If we could prove the acquiring of information about the world not via one's own sensory organs, we could characterize a new theory of consciousness. Mind beyond brain, the non-local mind. A means to achieve this in a groundbreaking way would be to substantiate claims of out-of-body experiences. Neuropsychiatrist Peter Fenwick ardently believes a new science of consciousness must bloom, a radically novel framework within which to view it in order to comprehend it. Just as what was the budding of a unified theory of electromagnetism in 1820 by Danish scientist Hans Christian Ørsted required an entirely new set of scientific principles, consciousness may very likely prove to also require a fundamentally distinct sphere of natural science. Fenwick relates an oft-cited example of an OBE, an out-of-body experience, with serious ramifications for consciousness, yet as ever, regrettably without the verification under empirical conditions. A young woman called Maria suffered a cardiac arrest. She was treated in Seattle Hospital, and she had a remote viewing experience during her OBE. It was of a shoe on a window ledge at the very other side of the building, with a worn patch at the little toe and a lace under the heel, which a social worker then later confirmed to be completely true. The scientific perspective of the classic OBEs, for instance, of an anesthetized patient, is the individual's brain garners sensory information from the surrounding, for instance, activities of medical staff, thus constructing an internal image while positioning itself on the ceiling. So how or why a compromised brain could perform such an elaborate feat or building the image at such a specified vantage point is, as yet, inexplicable. Maria's is a particularly thought-provoking case. How would the brain feasibly gather information about an object her regular senses could not even perceive, had she been fully conscious? The alternative theory is that mind is separable from and independent of the brain somehow. Theoretically, this should be easy to put to the test. You place items only viewable from the ceiling in a hospital environment without the knowledge of anybody but the experimenters, And if in fact it is accurately reported by the near-death experiencer, this should represent paradigm-shifting evidence for non-local and against brain-based consciousness. And an especially fascinating modification of this experiment would be to use visual illusions in the items viewable by the prospective out-of-body experiences, because this exploits the perceptual apparatus of the brain, so would therefore not only verify the fact of extrasensory perception, but also the nature by which it is perceived. So in other words, perceived either as you or I would perceive it, that is still somehow non-locally mediated by the brain, and so having the same nature of mind, or being utterly distinct from the human psyche and the brain, perhaps akin to a transcendent immaterial soul. Sam Parnia, who's an intensive care physician at Southampton Hospital, authored the world's biggest study into NDEs over the course of 4 years, the AWARE study published in 2014. Of 101 cardiac arrest patients, 46% experienced memories post-cardiac arrest, such as a bright light or feeling of deja vu or seeing family members. 9% had officialized near-death experiences, and 2%, that is 2 people of the 101, described full awareness, i.e. explicit recall of seeing and hearing actual events related to their resuscitation. So studies such as these are potentially redefining of everything we know, yet the materialistic model is so deeply entrenched. Extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence. Currently, there is no well-described physical principles by which perception can be experienced, or memory may be stored in any other way other than within the brain. However, there are a wealth of intriguing, albeit marginalized concepts conceived by ingenious minds through time. William James, the father of psychology, in his book Human Immortality in 1898, discusses that beyond this consensual reality, there are further realities from which something akin to a soul may emanate. Through the brain, a beam of consciousness is transmitted and modified. He writes, "The fangs of cerebralistic materialism are drawn. All abstract notions sound unreal. That our brains, as colored lenses, admitting light from the suprasolar source, at the same time tinging and restricting it, has a thoroughly fantastic sound. Manipulated brains produce manipulated minds." While one may argue for generation of consciousness from the brain, one equally may posit transmission hypotheses. That is, if we analogize the brain to a computer and the mind to the internet, if we break the computer, we no longer have access to the internet. Yet, the internet is not affected in any way. It is still very much there. And importantly, we do not theorize that the computer generated the internet in the first place, merely that it was connected to it and acted as a conduit for the experience of it. Carl Jung, the contemporary of Sigmund Freud, in one of his essays, Structure of the Unconscious in 1916, coined the term the collective unconscious. The idea that part of the mind exists extraneous to the brain, unbound by time and space, as a reservoir of human experience inherited from our ancestors. This provides an explanation for why similar themes and images, he termed the archetypes, emerge in different people's hallucinations, dreams, religions, mythologies, and even near-death experiences, which Jung, fascinatingly, himself experienced. For instance, he recounts, after the death of her mother, a Japanese woman dreamt of standing in the middle of a river. The mother on one bank beckoning her, and Japanese NDEs include recurring motifs of rivers or water bodies, and Japanese Buddhism has rivers as symbolic of the divide between the earthly and supernatural realms. Thus, one might assume her cultural expectations to be conferred upon her dream. But the woman was brought up Christian her entire life, and had no conscious memory nor knowledge of any such symbolism. The Jungian collective unconscious potentially at work. Aldous Huxley, in his famous Doors of Perception in 1954, recounting his mescaline-induced psychedelic experience, tells us each one of us is potentially mind at large. Each person is at each moment capable of remembering all that has ever happened to him and of perceiving everything that is happening everywhere in the universe. But insofar as we are animals, our business is at all costs to survive. To make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. What comes out at the other end is a measly trickle of the kind of consciousness which will help us to stay alive on the surface of this particular planet. Sir John Eccles, a neurophysiologist and philosopher, and 1963 Nobel laureate for his characterization of synaptic function, propounded a fascinating hypothesis. Fundamental neural units of cerebral cortex, he called dendrons, are 60 micrometers long cylindrical bundles of neurons in the 6 outer layers of the cortical laminae. And each of approximately 40 million of these dendrons is linked with an indivisible unit of mind, the psychon, or mental atom. Top-down activity of willed thought or action is facilitated by the psychons acting upon the dendrons, while the bottom-up action of dendrons upon psychons is responsible for perception. Jacobo Gringberg-Zilberbaum, a Mexican neuroscientist who disappeared mysteriously in 1994, developed a field theory of mind which was influenced by shamanistic culture. The electromagnetic fields generated by passages of nerve impulses, i.e. charged atoms moving across neuronal membranes, in some way interact with the fundamental fabric of the universe. This allows, according to him, for transmission of information between brains, where such effect is strongest when the brains are in a similar state, for instance, experiencing profound empathy for one another, such as elicited from psychedelic or empathogenic drugs. Finally, Rupert Sheldrake, a biologist presently at Oxford, theorizes that what he coins morphic resonance to explain how memory may exist independently of the brain. Morphogenetic fields, omnipresent structures akin to, yet much subtler than electromagnetic fields, for instance, are imprinted with information of a pattern of an organism's behavior, in turn modifying other similar brains to become more likely to reproduce this behavior. And this putatively accounts for rats in one laboratory learning maze shapes, while other rats in labs across the globe simultaneously acquire the same ability, or academics seeming to develop the same ideas or make discoveries at coinciding times. For instance, Leibniz in Germany and Newton in England with calculus. Or even crystals being evidenced to form their unique crystalline structures more readily in one lab the more the crystal has been made in others. In encapsulating what he famously calls the hard problem of consciousness, Australian philosopher of mind David Chalmers writes, "Why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience, the quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle sea? How can we explain why there is something it is like to entertain a mental image or to experience an emotion? It is widely agreed that experiences arises from a physical basis. But we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does." Thank you very much. So, yeah, questions? Mushrooms. Well, I think I'm not so certain like whether or not to comment on the legal status of it. Yeah, I mean, it makes you a fun guy. It makes you a fun guy. That's exactly right. I mean, the experience from it, like Aldous Huxley wrote the whole of Dawes' Perception about, this was due to mescaline, which is a very similar psychedelic substances. They're all similar. They all act on the serotonin receptors. The science behind what happens in the brain when psychedelics are interacting with it is amazing, and the implications of it is amazing, because it can essentially like funnel into exactly what Aldous Huxley was talking about when he talks about the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system that mind at large is funneled and filtered through, because the recent like conclusions about what psychedelics are doing by like David Nutt in Imperial, for instance, they basically conclude that what it does to the brain is it massively inhibits this part of the brain which is responsible for very efficient communication between brain areas. So what happens is the brain is forced to communicate in such ways that it hasn't communicated with itself before. Like, it opens up incredible new pathways, and it's so other than this connectivity, this like incredible like opened up connectivity between all the regions of the brain, they never found in the very advanced like neuroimaging that they were doing. They were using like magnetoencephalography and stuff as well. It never at once found an increase in activity, which they found like absolutely like astonishing, because they thought because it was a hallucinogen, like a prototypical hallucinogen, it would make massive activity within like the occipital cortex, like which is to do with like, vision and everything. But they didn't find that. They just found inhibition, global inhibition in the brain. So essentially, what their final like conclusion is that the less the brain is active, the more conscious experience, which kind of mirrors exactly what Huxley was talking about. So yeah, maybe it should be legal.
I've really enjoyed your talk. Thank you, Pascal. And I wonder, you're someone who's studying neuroscience. These ideas that you've shared with us, are they? We had Rupert Sheldrake speaking for us last year.
Really?
And yeah. And,
my God, I missed that.
And you missed it. But my experience is that most scientists seem to view him as a fringe scientist, or they call him a pseudoscientist, and they reject his ideas. And it's great to hear you sharing some of these ideas with us tonight. Are these things that you've learned on your course, or would you say this is still considered fringe science?
Well, this is the interesting thing, yeah, because I have to, like, that's why I really wanted to be here to talk about this kind of stuff, and I've done similar things before, and because I don't get those opportunities in my course, for instance, I think in one of the last like little speech things about this that I did before, I mentioned that the sheer mentioning of like consciousness in my neuroscience with psychology course was just cringed at. There was just, I could count the number of times the word consciousness was said in my lectures like on one hand, because they just don't know what to say, because it's just so mystical and mysterious a concept to grapple with. But yeah,
it's the elephant in the room for science, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. Is there any validity, do you think, in the morphic theory, using, for example, the idea of 100 monkeys?
So the 100 monkeys thing, like maybe people know, is that the concept that if 100 monkeys were to learn a certain activity at one point, then 100 monkeys on the other side of the globe will spontaneously pick up an aptitude to learn this particular thing incredibly quickly, more quickly than before. And it's interesting because it also has to be similar brain. So all these theories that I was kind of talking about, they're overlapping. They're talking about almost the same thing in kind of different language, because like the Mexican neuroscientist who disappeared in 1994, no one knows what that's about. He states that the brains have to be in similar states. So it's like the brain is a kind of it's a device which is a receptacle like for consciousness. It's not the producer of it, but it's a receptacle for consciousness, and therefore is going to be receptive to consciousnesses which kind of map onto it. So I just find that like whole, just intuitively, maybe not, I haven't done like substantiating experimentation myself, but intuitively I think this idea that brains can absorb consciousness. So when the morphic resonance concept is that there's almost like this uploading mechanism to these morphic fields of information, and it can happen. It's bidirectional, right? So it's like bottom up of the uploading of this information to the morphic field, and then top down into the downloading of this information to brains which are receptive to this similar information. And I think there's lots of other anecdotal things which really kind of support each other.
The one when I was a kid was the blue tits and milk bottles. So when we used to get milk delivered with metal tops, blue tits learnt in one area, learnt to, if you pecked the top, you could drink a whole pint of milk, and this seemed to spread too quickly for it to have been learnt generation to generation. It was almost as if there is a hive mind of blue tits, well, not just blue tits, but and that was one I remember from the 80s. Yeah,
I think that there's prolific possible evidence, just depending on where you look, but the mainstream scientific dogma is just so embossed. And basically, why I think one of the core reasons why they're so vehemently against it, treating it as non-pseudoscience, is like mainstream science, is because of the implications of it. So the implications could be that non-local mind, it will just throw materialism, which the whole of contemporary science is just based, predicated on, just out the window. But also there's spiritual connotations of it, which I think freak them out, because if the mind could be non-local, then it could very well be synonymous with the soul, and therefore there's an afterlife, and therefore there's a God, and therefore, So I think that's like a big part of it.
Are you familiar with the talks that Graham Hancock and Rupert Sheldrake gave for TED?
Yeah.
Do you know the story about...
I think they're all banned. That's why they're the best ones to watch, the banned ones.
Absolutely, yeah. So they're invited to speak at TED for a conference called Challenging Existing Paradigms. And Graham Hancock spoke about how he thought psychedelics could be useful. He'd use psychedelics to cure himself of addiction. And there are theories that psychedelics may have played a role in the development and acceleration of consciousness. And Rupert Sheldrake talked about some potential dogmas within science, and Ted's response was to ban the talks and say these are invalid, we have to remove them.
Because they're not mainstream.
Yeah,
it's great.
And so I think you're right, we are up against a certain science mafia at present, which denies the opportunity for this kind of information.
Yeah. And if it wasn't so marginalised and put down, then the sheer research that could be done into it and the sheer knowledge and the point of understanding that we'd be at now would be phenomenal. So it's pretty regressible.
How much research has been done on very small brain creatures, social animals, ants and termites and that sort of thing, on how much you can analyse what they're doing in terms of iterative series, you go left, I go right, whatever, series of simple rules. Well, is there any evidence to suggest that there is a common consciousness in
I have no idea about insect research. I'm not an entomologist, fortunately, but no, because you're right, because they do tend to act like having a hive mind, right? This almost sharing of consciousness. And they're all pieces of this singular consciousness. They happen to appear like individual organisms, but they're just potentially different clusters of neurons in our brain, for instance, which emergently have consciousness about them and therefore can coordinate themselves. Yeah, but I don't know about research done into it.
Question here.
I mean, there's always the possibility to conclude that consciousness is induced by chemistry of the mind, clearly, and therefore it's an illusion.
The consciousness is an illusion. Yeah.
Can you explain that?
This is the thing, it's so hard to explain the concept of it being an illusion.
Because your mind synapses and everything, they fire off on the basis that chemicals react with one another. And you experience through that. In the same way as a camera film represents the vista of the picture that it takes. It's only a representation of what it's seeing. It's not really exactly the same way as the mind is.
Yeah, I mean, no, because the illusion theory is like a very important thing to bring up, but like it's difficult to make like accurate analogies because you're like your analogy of like the picture being an illusion of the reality which lies outside. Like you cannot really think of analogies when it comes to paralleling consciousness because they are fundamentally, utterly different things, subjectivity and objectivity.
To come to a conclusion within your study.
Me?
You like moving towards thinking in a certain way. Actually, I think that's right.
I don't really resonate with the illusion idea. Like mainly as simply as coming down to like, you know, Descartes saying, you know, I think therefore I am, and therefore and to say that that which is the only thing that you can be sure of is actually something that you are totally dismissing all of a sudden as true. And in fact being the last thing that's true is just illusory. I can't like reconcile that in my mind. It's just not in. It's just I don't. So basically, yeah, like in what you're asking, like what kind of like worldview am I coming to like resonate with? It's definitely not that this is producing us. I really don't believe that at all. I think that there is incredible wealth of evidence, as I kind of listed before, that do imply that theory. That when there is manipulation in any which way of the brain, that therefore we correlate it with the manipulation, the changes in our minds. But I really do subscribe to that kind of analogy I made. That usually I changed it. Usually it's just the analogy of a TV and the waves, the radio waves coming to it, and so your brain being the TV and your mind, as it were, being the waves through the satellite. But I kind of like the computer internet kind of idea better. So that really does like resonate with me in terms of the idea of consciousness. Yeah. In a sense, I'm very glad you brought that up because I mean quantum physics is nothing that I can really comprehend. But no, there's so many parallels with quantum physics, obviously. Yeah, exactly. So the idea that consciousness has a role to play in matter in the universe. So the idea that consciousness is actually necessary to what's called like collapsing the wave function of the wave-particle duality of matter, and only when consciousness is involved, the function is collapsed, and therefore it coalesces into matter, which is in a particular point in space and time, as opposed to being potentially like super impositional and acting all over the place, potentially like two places at once, or you know, and it all gets extremely like spooky. What Einstein did called he was kind of trying to be derisive of it when he was talking about entanglement, which is a corollary of like quantum physics. He called it spooky action at a distance, which is when two particles have been associated with each other and they somehow have some kind of like bond, and then they're separated regardless of the distance. Like could be different ends of the galaxy, and then when you manipulate one, the other one is manipulated at exactly the same time, instantaneously, and that's entanglement. But yeah, so for consciousness, like also so there is this theory that is just amazing, which is by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, and it's called the OR theory, which is the orchestrated objective reduction theory. So they first published this in 1996. So I'm just going to read this note that I had because I didn't incorporate it into what I said. But so this is the note that I wrote. So this proposes that quantum coherence and wave function self-collapse, which transpires within the neuronal microtubules, to be at last. So this, according to them, is imperative for consciousness. The human brain is a perfect quantum computer, and the soul is simply information stored on the quantum level. So it's essentially what they like to refer to as quantum consciousness. Informational elements accumulating in life, and at death drains elsewhere. The microtubules are the most suitable proteins in neurons, according to them, as carriers of quantum properties. For they remain in quantum states for extended time, and they will be the functional units of a quantum computer. So microtubules, so the ultrastructure of a neuron is like, so if you imagine a neuron, and it's got these very long protein filamentous filaments in the center, and usually like for decades they were just thought to be just like for structural purposes and for transport purposes, like transporting neurotransmitters from one end to the other. But they compose of tubulin. And so these guys, Hameroff and Penrose, they theorize that these dimers of tubulin, which make up the microtubule in the center, they engage in quantum activity. They're the perfect receptacles for quantum activity. And through whatever coherences in the world of quantum physics, this is actually the facilitator of consciousness. And like when you hear Stuart Hameroff like talking about this theory, he often talks about consciousness being loosened at death, and the quantum information essentially leaking from the brain, and it's temporarily in this leaked form, almost suspended in animation in the fabric of the universe. And this is what accounts for the OBE and the near-death experience. And it's very interesting because it doesn't. This is the way I take it. It doesn't necessarily imply that there is, despite the incredible rich and like narrative of the NDE, it doesn't imply an afterlife per se, because these people inevitably return to life, and that their experience may just be like this non-local consciousness existing in this leaked out quantum state, kind of like floating around their brains just temporarily until it can get like absorbed back into it inevitably. Yeah.